On a cold February morning in 1503, Queen Elizabeth of York died in the Tower of London shortly after giving birth to a daughter, Catherine, who lived only 8 days. In the span of less than a year, he had lost both his eldest son, Arthur, and his beloved wife. The Tudor dynasty, barely 20 years old, was losing infant heirs at an alarming rate. What no one in that grief-stricken room could have known was that this moment was just the beginning of a biological catastrophe that would plague the Tudor family for 4 generations, ultimately driving one of history's most famous royal bloodlines to complete and utter extinction. This is the story of how infertility, miscarriage, and mysterious illnesses conspired to destroy the House of Tudor from within, claim after claim, child after child, until there was simply no one left. The Tudor infertility crisis didn't begin with Henry VIII and his infamous 6 wives. It started a generation earlier with his parents, and the warning signs were already unmistakable. When Henry Tudor seized the English throne at the Battle of Bosworth Field in 1485, defeating Richard III and ending the bloody Wars of the Roses, he desperately needed to secure his shaky new dynasty. His claim to the throne was tenuous at best, tracing back through his mother, Margaret Beaufort, to an illegitimate line descended from John of Gaunt. To legitimize his rule and unite the warring factions that had torn England apart for 3 decades, Henry married Elizabeth of York, the eldest daughter of the Yorkist king Edward IV. The marriage brilliantly united the Red Rose of Lancaster with the White Rose of York, creating the iconic Tudor rose that would become the symbol of the new dynasty. It was a political masterstroke. But what seemed like a fairy tale beginning would soon reveal itself as the opening chapter of a reproductive nightmare. Elizabeth of York became pregnant almost immediately after her wedding to Henry in January 1486. Their first son, Arthur, was born just 8 months later in September, possibly premature, or possibly conceived before the official wedding ceremony. The birth of the male heir so quickly seemed like a divine blessing, a sign that God favored the new Tudor dynasty. Henry named his firstborn son Arthur deliberately, invoking the legendary King of the Britons, connecting his shaky Welsh lineage to England's mythical Golden Age. The boy was christened with spectacular ceremony, and the entire kingdom celebrated. Finally, after decades of civil war and uncertainty, England had a clear line of succession. The future seemed secure. But that security was an illusion. Over the next 17 years, Elizabeth of York would endure at least 7, possibly 8 or more pregnancies. The historical records are incomplete, and some historians believe there may have been additional miscarriages that went unrecorded. What we know for certain is this: Elizabeth gave birth to Arthur in 1486, Margaret in 1489, Henry in 1491, Elizabeth in 1492, Mary in 1596, Edmund in 1599, and Catherine in 1503. Out of those 7 or 8 children, only 4 survived infancy. Young Elizabeth died at age 3 in 1495. Edmund, who had been styled Duke of Somerset despite never being formally invested with the title, died at just 1 year old in 1500, possibly from plague. Catherine lived only 8 days before dying in February 1503, and then there was the devastating loss of Arthur. Prince Arthur had seemed healthy throughout most of his youth, contrary to Victorian-era claims that he was sickly and frail. Contemporary accounts describe him as tall for his age, with reddish hair, small eyes, and a high-bridged nose, resembling his younger brother Henry, who was considered extremely handsome. Arthur had been well-educated, fluent in Latin, and trained in the arts of kingship from an early age. In November 1501, at age 15, Arthur married Catherine of Aragon, the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain, in a spectacular ceremony at St. Paul's Cathedral in London. The marriage represented a major diplomatic triumph for Henry VII, allying England with one of Europe's most powerful kingdoms. After the wedding festivities, Arthur and Catherine traveled to Ludlow Castle in the Welsh Marches, where Arthur held court as Prince of Wales. They spent the winter there together as newlyweds, establishing their household and preparing for their future as King and Queen of England. But in late March 1502, disaster struck. Both Arthur and Catherine fell ill with a mysterious sickness that was described in contemporary accounts as a malign vapor which proceeded from the air. The symptoms came on suddenly, just as Prince Arthur had been performing his ceremonial duties. 9 days before his death, he had carried out the traditional Maundy Thursday rituals at Ludlow, showing no signs of illness whatsoever. Then, with terrifying speed, he was struck down. The exact nature of Arthur's illness remains one of history's great medical mysteries. The most commonly suggested diagnosis is the dreaded English sweating sickness, a terrifying disease that had first appeared in England in 1485, coincidentally the same year Henry Tudor seized the throne. The sweating sickness was unlike any other epidemic disease of the Tudor era, where plague and other illnesses tended to concentrate in crowded urban areas and spread slowly. The sweating sickness struck with lightning speed and showed a peculiar preference for rural populations and the wealthy. It could kill a person within 4 to 5 hours of the first symptoms appearing. Victims experienced sudden onset of fever, redness of the face and body, severe headaches, intense thirst, stomach and joint pains, vomiting, breathlessness, and torrential sweating that soaked through clothing and bedding. Many victims died so quickly that they literally collapsed in the streets or were found dead in their beds, having succumbed in the night. The disease came in 5 major waves across 70 years, terrorizing Tudor England before mysteriously vanishing forever after 1551. To this day, scientists have no definitive explanation for what caused it, though theories range from hantavirus to a now extinct strain of influenza to relapsing fever spread by ticks and lice. In Arthur's case, both he and Catherine showed symptoms of the illness at the same time, which supports the sweating sickness theory. Catherine recovered after several days of illness, weak and bedridden but alive. Arthur appeared to improve initially, giving everyone hope that the young prince would pull through. But then he relapsed. The illness that had seemed to release its grip on him returned with devastating force. On April 2, 1502, just 6 months after his glorious wedding, Prince Arthur Tudor died at Ludlow Castle. He was 15 years old, 6 months short of his 16th birthday. The news took 3 days to reach the royal court at Greenwich Palace. When a messenger finally arrived on April 5th, the king's confessor was given the grim task of breaking the news to Henry VII. According to chroniclers, the king broke down completely, overcome with grief both for his son and for the future of his dynasty. Elizabeth of York, devastated by the loss of her firstborn child, came to comfort her husband. She reminded him that his mother had given birth to only one child, himself, yet he had survived to become king. She told him that God had left them with a son, young Henry, and 2 daughters, Margaret and Mary, and that they were both still young enough to have more children. It was Elizabeth who held the family together in that moment of crisis, suppressing her own overwhelming grief to console her husband and reassure him that all was not lost. But later that same day, the Queen's composure finally shattered. Overcome with her own sorrow, she broke down weeping so violently that messengers had to fetch the king to comfort her in return. The royal couple grieved together, clinging to each other in the face of catastrophic loss. And then, with what must have seemed like desperate determination to fulfill her promise to her husband, Elizabeth became pregnant again within months of Arthur's death. She was 36 years old by this point, and pregnancy was far more dangerous for women in their late 30s in the Tudor era than it had been in their 20s. Elizabeth had already endured at least 6 previous pregnancies, multiple births, and the physical toll of repeated childbearing. Nevertheless, she was determined to give her husband another heir, to strengthen the succession and secure the Tudor line. In early 1503, heavily pregnant, Elizabeth went into confinement at the Tower of London to await the birth. The custom of the time required expectant royal mothers to withdraw from public life about a month before their due date, secluding themselves in darkened, overheated chambers attended only by female servants and midwives. On February 2, 1503, Elizabeth went into labor prematurely. The delivery was difficult and dangerous. She gave birth to a baby girl, whom they named Catherine, possibly after Arthur's widow, Catherine of Aragon, or Catherine of Valois, the foundress of the Tudor dynasty. The baby was weak, born too early, and within 8 days, little Catherine had died. Elizabeth of York, already weakened by a difficult labor, fell ill with puerperal fever, the dreaded postpartum infection that killed so many women in the days before antiseptics and antibiotics. The bacteria that entered her body during childbirth, probably through tears in the birth canal or an incompletely delivered placenta, multiplied rapidly in her bloodstream. Fever consumed her, her abdomen swelled with infection, pain racked her body. Henry VII, frantic with worry, sent urgent summonses to specialist doctors across London, begging them to attend his dying wife. Unusually for a king of that era, Henry didn't wait for news at one of his palaces. Instead, he paced outside Elizabeth's chambers, desperate and terrified, as close as protocol would allow him to be to his suffering wife. Nothing could save her. On February 11, 1503, her 37th birthday, Elizabeth of York died. Henry VII was devastated. He retreated into seclusion, ordering everyone to leave him alone to mourn. Chroniclers report that he became reclusive after her death, never fully recovering from the loss. He commissioned an elaborate tomb for Elizabeth at Westminster Abbey and had himself buried beside her when he died 6 years later in 1509. He never remarried, despite considerable pressure from his counselors to take another wife and produce more heirs. The love between Henry and Elizabeth, which had begun as a political arrangement, had apparently grown into something deep and genuine. And now, in the space of less than a year, Henry VII had lost his eldest son and heir, a newborn daughter, and his beloved wife. The Tudor dynasty that had seemed so secure at Arthur's birth in 1486 now hung by the slenderest of threads, dependent entirely on the survival of 10-year-old Prince Henry. Let's pause here and consider the statistics. Out of Elizabeth of York's 7 or 8 known pregnancies, only 4 children survived to adulthood. That's a survival rate of just 50 to 57%. Compared to modern standards, it's horrific. But even for the Tudor era, when infant mortality was high across all social classes, this was unusually bad. Other noble families of the period had far better success rates. This pattern of reproductive failure wasn't limited to bad luck or the general dangers of Tudor medicine. Something deeper was at work, something in the bloodline itself, and it was about to get catastrophically worse in the next generation. When Henry VII died on April 21, 1509, his surviving son became King Henry VIII at age 17. The new king was everything his elder brother had been and more. Where Arthur had been described as delicate and gentle, Henry was robust, athletic, and charismatic. He stood over 6 feet tall, towering over most men of his era. He was skilled in jousting, hunting, and swordplay. He composed music, wrote poetry, and was fluent in Latin, French, and Spanish. He was considered one of the most handsome princes in Europe, with reddish gold hair, fair skin, and a powerful muscular build. He had a 42-inch chest and radiated health and vigor. Contemporary observers swooned over him. The Venetian ambassador described him as the handsomest potentate I ever set eyes on. But beneath this dazzling exterior, Henry VIII carried within him the seeds of a reproductive catastrophe that would make his mother's struggles look mild by comparison. Over his lifetime, Henry VIII would marry 6 women, execute 2 of them, divorce 2 others, see 1 die in childbirth, and outlive them all except for his final wife. He would become obsessed with producing a male heir, to the point of tearing England away from the Catholic Church, dissolving hundreds of monasteries, executing thousands of people who opposed him, and fundamentally reshaping English religion, politics, and society. And despite all this desperate effort, despite 6 wives and multiple mistresses, despite being one of the most powerful monarchs in Europe with access to the best medical care available, Henry VIII would die having produced only 3 legitimate children who survived infancy. And all 3 of them would die childless, ending the Tudor line completely. The numbers tell a devastating story. According to a landmark 2021 study published in the Journal of Interdisciplinary History by researchers Valerie Shrimplin and Chana Jayasena, 70% of the legitimate pregnancies attributed to Henry VIII and his 6 wives resulted in miscarriage or stillbirth. 70%. That's a catastrophic failure rate. To put that in perspective, the researchers compared Henry's reproductive success to that of 31 noblemen who were closely associated with him at court. These were men of similar age, social status, and lifestyle. Out of 179 pregnancies recorded for the wives of these courtiers, only 10% ended in miscarriage or stillbirth. 10% for Henry's courtiers versus 70% for Henry himself. That's a seven-fold difference. This wasn't bad luck. This wasn't just the general dangers of Tudor medicine affecting everyone equally. This was something specific to Henry. Across at least 11 documented pregnancies with 3 of his 6 wives, Henry fathered only 4 children who survived infancy. Princess Mary, daughter of Catherine of Aragon, Princess Elizabeth, daughter of Anne Boleyn, Prince Edward, son of Jane Seymour, and Henry Fitzroy, his illegitimate son by his teenage mistress Bessie Blount. That's it. 4 living children out of at least 11, possibly 13 or more pregnancies. And remember, Henry's sexual partners were clearly fertile women. Catherine of Aragon had been married to Prince Arthur first, though that marriage was allegedly never consummated. After Arthur's death, Catherine married Henry VIII and quickly became pregnant, proving her fertility. Anne Boleyn successfully carried her first pregnancy to term. Jane Seymour gave birth to Edward. These were not infertile women. So, what was going wrong? Let's look at the heartbreaking timeline of Henry's first wife, Catherine of Aragon. Catherine and Henry married on June 11, 1509, just weeks after Henry became king. She was 23 years old, he was 17. They had known each other for years, as Catherine had been living in England since her marriage to Arthur in 1501. After Arthur's death, Catherine had spent 7 years in limbo, a widow in a foreign country, her status uncertain, her future unclear. Henry's decision to marry her solved multiple problems at once. It honored the alliance with Spain, it provided Henry with an experienced consort who understood politics, and it satisfied Henry's genuine affection for Catherine. By September 1509, just 5 months after their wedding, Catherine was pregnant. This was an excellent sign, suggesting that both partners were fertile and that England would soon have an heir to secure the succession. But on January 31, 1510, tragedy struck. Catherine went to premature labor and gave birth to a stillborn daughter. The baby was far enough along that Catherine had felt it move in her womb. Henry had written to his father-in-law Ferdinand of Aragon earlier, excitedly reporting that the child in her womb is alive. But when Catherine delivered prematurely, at what was likely 7 to 8 months gestation, the baby girl was already dead. Even worse, after the stillbirth, Catherine's abdomen remained swollen and even began to increase in size. Her physicians, utterly baffled, concluded that she must still be pregnant with a twin of the baby she'd lost. This phantom pregnancy persisted for months, with Catherine and her doctors convinced that another child might yet be born. Of course, there was no twin. What Catherine was experiencing was likely a combination of retained placental tissue, infection, and fluid accumulation that mimicked continued pregnancy. It must have been psychologically devastating, losing a baby and then enduring months of false hope that another child might yet be born. But Catherine was nothing if not resilient. Months later, she was pregnant again. On January 1st, 1511, Catherine gave birth to a living son. The kingdom erupted in celebration. The baby was named Henry, after his father, and was given the title Duke of Cornwall. King Henry VIII was beside himself with joy. He ordered a lavish tournament at Westminster to celebrate the birth of his heir. Knights jousted in elaborate armor, banners flew, trumpets blared, and the king himself participated in the competitions, riding magnificently in armor decorated with his newborn son's name. Courtiers showered the royal couple with congratulations. Foreign ambassadors sent glowing reports back to their home countries about England's new prince. The Tudor succession seemed secure at last. And then, 52 days later, on February 22, 1511, the baby prince died. The cause of death was not recorded. He may have succumbed to infection, to a congenital defect, to sudden infant death syndrome, or to any number of ailments that claimed infant lives in an era before modern medicine. Whatever killed him, the loss was absolutely devastating. The lavish celebrations were still fresh in everyone's memory. The tournament armor emblazoned with the baby's name still hung in the armory. And now, instead of a christening, there was a funeral. Instead of joy, there was crushing grief. Catherine was heartbroken. Henry was stunned. The entire court went into mourning. But Catherine, dutiful and determined, pressed on. In September 1513, she gave birth again. This time, the records are unclear whether the baby, a boy, was stillborn or died very shortly after birth. The Venetian calendar of state papers records that a male heir was born to the King of England and will inherit the crown, suggesting the baby was alive at birth, but other sources indicate he died immediately. Either way, another potential heir was lost. In November 1514, Catherine was pregnant once more. Ambassadors reported that she was visibly showing by summer. But in November, after 8 months of pregnancy, Catherine gave birth to a stillborn son. The Venetian ambassador recorded that the queen has been delivered of a stillborn male child of 8 months, to the very great grief of the whole court. One source even suggested that Catherine's grief over the ongoing political tensions between her husband and her father, King Ferdinand of Aragon, had caused such extreme stress that she ejected an immature fetus. Catherine herself remarked bitterly that God must love her to visit upon her the privilege of so much sorrow. The pattern was becoming unmistakable and terrifying. Then, in 1515, hope returned. Catherine became pregnant again. This time, there was cautious optimism. In January 1516, Catherine's father Ferdinand died in Spain, and the news was deliberately kept secret for some time out of fear that grief would cause the queen to miscarry yet again. Catherine went into confinement at Greenwich Palace in March, waited for the birth. And on February 18, 1516, at Greenwich Palace, Catherine of Aragon gave birth to a living, healthy baby girl. 3 days later, the baby was baptized and named Mary, after Henry's favorite sister, Mary Tudor. Heralds proclaimed, "God send and give long life unto the right high, right noble and excellent Princess Mary, Princess of England, and daughter of our most dread sovereign lord, the King's Highness." Catherine and Henry must have been overwhelmed with relief. After so many losses, so much grief, so many dead sons and stillborn babies, they finally had a living child. Mary wasn't a son, which was disappointing to Henry and to the kingdom. The Tudor succession depended on male heirs, at least according to conventional thinking of the era. No woman had successfully ruled England in her own right. But Mary was healthy, she was legitimate, and she was alive. That was something. That was everything, really, after so many dead babies. And Catherine was only 30 years old. She and Henry were young enough to have more children. Surely, after finally producing one living child, there would be others. Surely a son would come in time. But it was not to be. Catherine had one more recorded pregnancy. On November 9, 1518, she gave birth to a stillborn daughter. After that, at age 33, Catherine's pregnancy is simply stopped. Historians debate why. Some suggest she may have gone through early menopause, possibly brought on by the physical and psychological stress of repeated pregnancy losses. Others suggest that Henry simply stopped sleeping with her, having given up hope that she could produce a living son. There are hints that Catherine may have suffered from an eating disorder connected to her intense religious devotion. She was known to fast excessively, sometimes to the point that even the Pope wrote to her, urging her to take better care of her health. Prolonged fasting and poor nutrition during pregnancy can cause miscarriages, stillbirths, and low birth weight babies. It's possible that Catherine's religious practices, meant to earn God's favor, actually contributed to her reproductive failures. But regardless of the cause, the outcome was undeniable. Catherine of Aragon had endured at least 6 confirmed pregnancies, possibly more. Only one child, Mary, survived. That's a survival rate of less than 17%. It was a catastrophe. And Henry was beginning to wonder, with increasing frustration and anger, whose fault it was. The conventional wisdom of the Tudor era placed all blame for reproductive failure on women. Men were assumed to be perpetually fertile unless they were physically impotent. If a marriage failed to produce children, or if pregnancies repeatedly ended in miscarriage or stillbirth, everyone automatically assumed the woman was at fault. She had a weak womb. She was cursed by God. She had sinned and was being punished. The man, especially a king, was above suspicion. But modern medical science tells a very different story. According to recent research, male factor infertility is a major cause of recurrent pregnancy loss. Problems with sperm quality, sperm DNA integrity, and chromosomal abnormalities in sperm can all lead to repeated miscarriages even when the female partner is perfectly healthy. And when one man has repeated pregnancy failures with multiple different female partners, as Henry did with Catherine of Aragon, Anne Boleyn, and Jane Seymour, suspicion should naturally fall on the man, not the women. In 1528, Henry VIII began to pursue an annulment of his marriage to Catherine of Aragon. His justification was that the marriage had been invalid from the start because Catherine had previously been married to his brother Arthur. According to Levitical law in the Bible, a man should not marry his brother's widow. The fact that the marriage had failed to produce a living male heir, Henry argued, was proof that God disapproved of the union. Of course, this convenient theological argument conveniently ignored the fact that Catherine and Henry did have a living child, Princess Mary. It also ignored the fact that Catherine had sworn repeatedly under oath that her marriage to Arthur had never been consummated. She had been a virgin when she married Henry, she insisted. Arthur had been too ill, too weak, too young. They had shared a bed for only a handful of nights before Arthur's mysterious illness struck at Ludlow. There had been no opportunity for consummation, Catherine maintained. Therefore, in the eyes of God and the Church, she had never truly been married to Arthur, and her marriage to Henry was valid. But Henry was determined. By this point, he had fallen obsessively in love with one of Catherine's ladies-in-waiting, a clever, dark-eyed, sharp-tongued young woman named Anne Boleyn. Anne was refusing to become Henry's mistress, insisting that if he wanted her, he would have to marry her. And Henry, convinced that Catherine's failure to produce a son meant God had cursed their marriage, decided that divorcing Catherine and marrying Anne was the solution to all his problems. Anne was young, she was fertile, and she was English. Surely she would give him the sons that Catherine could not. That's what Henry told himself. That's what Anne desperately hoped. But once again, the pattern of reproductive disaster continued. Anne's subsequent pregnancies are not as thoroughly documented as Catherine's, partly because Anne's marriage to Henry was much shorter, and partly because records from her time as queen were later destroyed or suppressed after her execution. But we know she had at least 2, possibly 3 miscarriages after Elizabeth's birth. There are suggestions that she may have lost a child in the summer of 1534, though the evidence is unclear. What is certain is that on January 29, 1536, Anne miscarried a male fetus at approximately 15 to 16 weeks gestation. This happened on the very same day that Catherine of Aragon was being buried, and just days after Henry had suffered a serious jousting accident that left him unconscious for 2 hours. The stress and shock might have triggered the miscarriage. Henry was devastated and furious. Another pregnancy lost, another dead son. And this time, ominously, he blamed Anne. The loss of that male fetus on January 29, 1536, sealed Anne Boleyn's fate. Henry became convinced that his marriage to Anne was also cursed, just as his marriage to Catherine had been. Perhaps Anne had bewitched him into marrying her. Perhaps she was a sorceress who had used dark magic to seduce him away from his true wife, Catherine. This paranoid reasoning, twisted and irrational, took hold in Henry's mind. Within months, Anne was arrested on trumped-up charges of adultery, incest, and treason. The charges were almost certainly false, fabricated by Henry's chief minister Thomas Cromwell to give the king legal justification to rid himself of a wife who had failed to produce a male heir. On May 19, 1536, just 3 years after becoming Queen of England, Anne Boleyn was beheaded at the Tower of London. She was in her early 30s, accused of sleeping with 5 men, including her own brother, convicted in a sham trial that wouldn't have passed muster in any legitimate court, and executed by a French swordsman specially imported for the occasion. Her real crime, of course, was failing to give Henry a son. Just 11 days later, Henry married again. His third wife was Jane Seymour, a quiet, demure lady-in-waiting who had served both Catherine of Aragon and Anne Boleyn. Jane had been carefully selected by Henry's advisors as the opposite of Anne in every way. Where Anne had been witty and sharp-tongued, Jane was meek and obedient. Where Anne had challenged Henry and argued with him, Jane submitted without question. And crucially, Jane came from a proven fertile family. Her mother had given birth to 10 children, 9 of whom survived to adulthood. Surely Jane would carry on that family fertility and finally give Henry the son he desperately needed. In early 1537, Jane became pregnant. This time, the pregnancy progressed smoothly. Jane showed no signs of miscarriage or complications. Astrologers and physicians confidently predicted a boy. Everything seemed to be going according to plan. Henry was cautiously optimistic, though the trauma of repeated pregnancy losses must have made him anxious. On October 12, 1537, at Hampton Court Palace, after a difficult and prolonged labor that lasted for 2 days and 3 nights, Jane Seymour gave birth to a living, healthy baby boy.
The kingdom exploded with joy. Bells rang across London. Bonfires blazed in celebration. Te Deum services of thanksgiving were held in churches throughout England. At last, after 28 years of marriage and countless dead babies, Henry VIII had a legitimate living son. The boy was christened Edward and was immediately proclaimed Duke of Cornwall and heir to the throne. Henry wept with relief and happiness. The Tudor succession was secure. England had its prince. Everything Henry had fought for, all the divorces, all the break with Rome, all the executions and the religious upheaval, it had all been worth it. He had his son. But the celebration was short-lived. Jane Seymour, weakened by the long and difficult labor, developed postpartum complications. In the days following Edward's birth, Jane showed signs of puerperal fever, the same infection that had killed Henry's mother, Elizabeth of York, 34 years earlier. Despite the best efforts of royal physicians, Jane's condition deteriorated rapidly. Fever consumed her. Her body, torn and traumatized by the difficult birth, couldn't fight off the bacterial infection spreading through her bloodstream. On October 24, 1537, just 12 days after giving birth to Henry's longed-for son, Jane Seymour died. She was not yet 30 years old. Henry was devastated. Of all his wives, Jane would be the one he remembered most fondly, the one he called his true wife, the one he asked to be buried beside when he eventually died. She had given him what no other woman could, a living, legitimate son, and it had killed her. This was the brutal reality of reproduction in the Tudor era. Giving birth to a healthy child was an achievement. Surviving the birth yourself was never guaranteed. And for women married to Henry VIII, the pressure to produce a son made every pregnancy a matter of life and death, politically and literally. Henry would marry 3 more times after Jane's death. He married Anne of Cleves in a political alliance that ended in divorce 6 months later, the marriage unconsummated. He married the teenage Catherine Howard in 1540 and had her executed for adultery in 1542. He married Catherine Parr, his 6th and final wife, in 1543, and she survived him, outliving the king who had executed 2 of his previous wives. But none of these later marriages produced any children. By the time Henry married Catherine Parr, he was 52 years old, morbidly obese, suffering from chronic leg ulcers that wouldn't heal, and almost certainly suffering from advanced venereal disease. His reproductive years were over. So what was actually wrong with Henry VIII? Why did 70% of his legitimate pregnancies end in catastrophe? Modern medical researchers have proposed several fascinating theories based on Henry's documented medical history, his lifestyle, and the patterns of pregnancy loss among his wives. One major theory focuses on something called the Kell blood group antigen. This theory was proposed in 2010 by bioarchaeologist Katrina Banks Whiteley and anthropologist Kyra Kramer in a groundbreaking paper published in the Historical Journal. The theory works like this. If Henry had a rare blood type called Kell positive, while his wives were Kell negative, this mismatch could explain the pattern of pregnancy losses. Here's the science. In a first pregnancy between a Kell positive man and a Kell negative woman, the baby can be born healthy if it inherits the Kell positive gene from its father. But during pregnancy, and especially during childbirth, some of the baby's Kell-positive blood cells can cross the placenta into the mother's bloodstream. The mother's immune system, encountering this foreign Kell antigen for the first time, produces antibodies against it. These antibodies stay in the mother's bloodstream permanently. In subsequent pregnancies, if another baby inherits the Kell-positive gene from the father, the mother's pre-existing antibodies cross the placenta and attack the baby's blood cells. This causes severe anemia in the fetus, leading to late-term miscarriage, stillbirth, or rapid neonatal death. The pattern is distinctive and consistent. First baby healthy, subsequent pregnancies catastrophic. And this pattern fits perfectly with the reproductive histories of both Catherine of Aragon and Anne Boleyn. Catherine's first baby, the stillborn daughter of 1510, died, but that could have been due to other factors like prematurity. Her second pregnancy produced Prince Henry, who lived for 52 days. That short life could fit the Kell incompatibility pattern if the baby was only mildly affected. But then all of Catherine's subsequent pregnancies ended in stillbirth or very early infant death. Anne Boleyn's pattern is even textbook. Her first child, Princess Elizabeth, was born perfectly healthy. But then Anne suffered multiple miscarriages of subsequent pregnancies, exactly as would be expected if she had developed Kell antibodies after Elizabeth's birth. Jane Seymour's single pregnancy also fits the theory. Prince Edward was Jane's first and only child with Henry, and he was born healthy, consistent with a first Kell-positive pregnancy. The theory even explains Princess Mary's survival. Mary was not Catherine's first pregnancy, but she could have inherited the recessive Kell-negative gene from Henry, making her immune to her mother's antibodies. Alternatively, some cases of Kell sensitization are mild enough that even the first pregnancy can be affected, which could explain the stillbirths that preceded Mary's birth. If Henry did have Kell-positive blood, it raises another intriguing possibility. There's a rare genetic condition called McLeod syndrome that only affects people with the Kell blood group. McLeod syndrome is a devastating disease that causes progressive muscle weakness, neurological problems, cognitive impairment that mimics dementia, and personality changes. The symptoms typically begin between the ages of 30 and 40, and this matches Henry's dramatic physical and mental decline in the second half of his life. In his youth, Henry was athletic, generous, intellectually curious, and generally well-liked. But after age 40, he transformed into a paranoid, cruel, physically disabled tyrant. He ballooned from a 42-inch chest and athletic build to a 58-inch chest and a waist of 54 inches, with a weight estimated at 392 pounds or 28 stone. His personality darkened. He became suspicious, vindictive, and prone to explosive rages. He executed 2 of his wives, countless courtiers, and thousands of religious dissenters. His chronic leg ulcers, which began after a jousting accident in 1536, never healed and produced a constant stench of putrefying flesh that courtiers could smell from rooms away. He had to be carried upstairs in a specially designed chair. By the end of his life, he was virtually immobile, in constant pain, and widely feared. Could McLeod syndrome explain Henry's reproductive failures and his dramatic midlife deterioration? It's possible, though impossible to prove without DNA testing of Henry's remains. But there's another major theory that focuses on male factor infertility. This theory was proposed in a major 2021 study published in the Journal of Interdisciplinary History. The researchers argued that Henry suffered from sperm damage that directly caused the recurrent miscarriages. Modern research has shown that DNA fragmentation in sperm is a major cause of repeated pregnancy loss. When sperm carry damaged DNA, they can still fertilize an egg, but the resulting embryo often fails to develop properly and is miscarried. What causes sperm DNA fragmentation? oxidative stress, which can result from obesity, poor diet, excessive exercise, trauma, and chronic illness. Let's look at Henry's lifestyle. In his youth, Henry was obsessed with jousting, hunting, and other violent sports. Jousting accidents and repeated physical trauma can damage the testes and impair sperm quality. Henry's famous jousting accident of 1536, which left him unconscious for 2 hours and may have caused traumatic brain injury, certainly could have worsened any pre-existing sperm problems. Then there's his diet. Historical records show that Henry consumed massive quantities of meat, bread, and ale, while eating very few fruits and vegetables. His diet was extraordinarily high in calories, protein, and fat, but desperately low in vitamins and fiber. This type of diet is known to increase oxidative stress and damage sperm DNA. And finally, there's Henry's progressive obesity. By his 30s, Henry was already significantly overweight. By his 40s, he was morbidly obese. Obesity is strongly associated with reduced sperm quality, hormonal imbalances, and erectile dysfunction. The combination of trauma from jousting, terrible diet, and increasing obesity creates a perfect storm for male factor infertility. What makes this theory compelling is the comparative data. Remember those 31 courtiers who served alongside Henry? Their pregnancy rate was only 10% compared to Henry's 70%. These courtiers lived in the same era, had access to similar medical care, and faced the same general health challenges as everyone else in Tudor England. But their reproductive outcomes were dramatically better than Henry's. The obvious conclusion: Henry himself was the problem. It wasn't Catherine's fault. It wasn't Anne's fault. It wasn't divine punishment or witchcraft or cursed marriages. It was Henry's faulty sperm, damaged by his lifestyle and possibly by genetic factors, killing pregnancy after pregnancy, baby after baby, for 28 years.
And there's one more piece of evidence that strongly implicates Henry: his illegitimate children, or rather, the lack thereof. For a man who had multiple mistresses over several decades, Henry acknowledged only one illegitimate child, Henry Fitzroy, born to Bessie Blount around 1519. That's it. One acknowledged bastard in a lifetime of sexual activity with numerous women. Compare this to some of his courtiers. Sir John Seymour, Jane Seymour's father, had 10 children with his wife, 9 of whom survived to adulthood. Charles Brandon, Duke of Suffolk and Henry's best friend, had at least 11 children by 4 different women. These men were proving their fertility repeatedly, easily, across multiple partners. Henry, with 6 wives and multiple mistresses, produced only 4 living children total. The pattern is undeniable. Now let's look at the tragic third generation, the children who inherited not just the Tudor throne, but apparently also a legacy of biological vulnerability. Prince Edward, Jane Seymour's hard-won son, became King Edward VI when his father died on January 28, 1547. Edward was only 9 years old, a child king who would never reach adulthood. Because Edward was so young, England was governed by a regency council, first led by his uncle Edward Seymour, Duke of Somerset, and then by John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland. Edward himself was deeply religious, intellectually gifted, and intensely interested in Protestant theology. He was tutored by brilliant scholars and could read Greek, Latin, and French fluently by his early teens. He studied Aristotle's Ethics in the original Greek and translated Cicero's philosophical works. He seemed, in many ways, to be a model prince, exactly the kind of educated, thoughtful ruler England needed. But his health was fragile in ways that would prove catastrophic. There's a persistent myth, originating from a misread 16th century letter, that Edward was sickly throughout his life. Modern historians have largely debunked this. Contemporary accounts describe Edward as a normal, healthy boy through most of his childhood. He was noted as being tall for his age, intellectually sharp, and physically active. But in April 1552, disaster struck. Edward contracted measles and possibly also smallpox at the same time. This combination of diseases, both highly dangerous in the Tudor era, nearly killed him. He survived, but the illnesses had a devastating effect that wouldn't become apparent for months.
One of the well-documented consequences of measles is that it suppresses the immune system, sometimes for months or even years after the initial infection. This immune suppression leaves the body vulnerable to opportunistic infections, particularly tuberculosis. In December 1552 or January 1553, just months after recovering from measles, Edward developed a persistent cough. At first, it seemed like a minor illness, a winter cold perhaps, but the cough didn't go away. It worsened steadily. By February 1553, when Edward's half-sister Mary visited him, she found him bedridden, weak, and clearly very ill. Edward rallied at various points over the next few months, showing temporary improvements that gave everyone false hope, but each relapse was worse than the last. By May 1553, the imperial ambassador described Edward's condition as desperate. By June, it was clear the young king was dying. The symptoms were horrific. Edward coughed up sputum that was described as greenish-yellow and black, sometimes streaked with pink from blood. His legs swelled so severely that he could no longer stand and had to remain in bed. He suffered from extreme weakness, weight loss, and progressive wasting away of his body. His hair began to fall out, his nails loosened and dropped off. He ran fevers that came and went. The royal physicians, utterly unable to help him, watched helplessly as their king deteriorated week by week, day by day. Edward himself knew he was dying. With remarkable composure for a 15-year-old boy, he set about trying to control what would happen to England after his death. He composed a document called My Device for the Succession, written in his own hand, attempting to alter the line of succession established by his father's will. Henry VIII's will had specified that if Edward died without heirs, the throne would pass first to his older half-sister Mary, and then, if Mary died without heirs, to his younger half-sister Elizabeth. But Edward had a problem with this arrangement. Mary was a staunch Catholic, and Edward was a committed Protestant who had overseen major religious reforms during his reign. He could not, would not, allow England to return to Catholicism after his death. So Edward attempted to bypass both of his half-sisters and leave the throne to his Protestant cousin, Lady Jane Grey, who had recently married Guilford Dudley, son of Edward's chief advisor. It was a desperate plan, probably influenced heavily by John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland, who stood to gain enormous power if his daughter-in-law became queen, and it was ultimately doomed to failure. On July 6, 1553, at approximately 8 o'clock in the evening, King Edward VI died at Greenwich Palace. He was 15 years old, just 9 months past his 15th birthday. His final words, recorded by those attending him, were, "I am faint. Lord, have mercy upon me, and take my spirit." At autopsy, surgeons opened Edward's chest and found, according to their report, 2 large putrefied ulcers in his lungs. The official cause of death was given as consumption, the Tudor term for tuberculosis. Modern medical analysis supports this diagnosis. Edward almost certainly died of tuberculosis that his immune system, suppressed by his earlier bout of measles, could not fight off. The infection ravaged his lungs, creating abscesses that filled with pus and rotting tissue, progressively destroying his ability to breathe. It was an agonizing death, made even more tragic by Edward's youth and by the fact that it could have been prevented if not for the measles infection that preceded it. Edward's death created an immediate succession crisis. Lady Jane Grey was proclaimed queen on July 10th and taken to the Tower of London to await her coronation. But Edward's half-sister Mary, warned in advance of her brother's death, had fled to East Anglia, where she gathered supporters and troops. 9 days after Jane's proclamation, Mary entered London in triumph, was declared the rightful queen, and had Jane arrested. Jane would be executed 7 months later, along with her husband Guilford Dudley, becoming one of the tragic figures of Tudor history, a teenage girl used as a political pawn and murdered for it. But it's worth pausing here to note something eerie about Edward's death. His uncle, Prince Arthur, had died at age 15 from a mysterious respiratory illness. Edward's half-brother, Henry Fitzroy, Duke of Richmond, had also died in his teens, possibly from tuberculosis or a related pulmonary condition. And Edward himself died at age 15 from a lung disease that presented with consumption-like symptoms but progressed unusually rapidly. 3 teenage boys in the Tudor family, all dying from similar respiratory illnesses before reaching adulthood. Some researchers have suggested that there may have been a genetic vulnerability in the Tudor line, possibly atypical cystic fibrosis or another inherited condition affecting the lungs. It's impossible to prove without genetic testing, but the pattern is striking. Whatever the cause, Edward's death was catastrophic for the Tudor succession. Henry VIII had broken with Rome, executed 2 wives, caused religious upheaval across England, and torn his kingdom apart, all to produce a male heir. And that heir had survived only 15 years, dying without marrying, without producing children, without leaving anyone to carry on the direct male line of the Tudor dynasty.
Now the crown passed to Mary, the daughter Henry had spent decades trying to disinherit, the daughter of Catherine of Aragon, the living reminder of everything Henry had tried to undo. Mary I became England's first crowned queen regnant in July 1553. She was 37 years old, the same age her mother Catherine of Aragon had been when she stopped having children. Mary's life up to this point had been traumatic beyond measure. She had been declared a princess at birth, then made illegitimate when her father divorced her mother, then forced to serve as a lady-in-waiting to her infant half-sister Elizabeth, then reinstated to the succession in her father's will, then nearly disinherited again by her half-brother Edward. She had watched her mother suffer and die in bitter exile. She had endured years of poverty, illness, and humiliation under her father's rule. She had developed debilitating menstrual problems and chronic health issues that plagued her throughout her life. And now, suddenly, she was queen. One of Mary's first orders of business as monarch was to marry and produce an heir. It was unthinkable that England's first ruling queen would not marry. The expectation was universal. Mary must take a husband, both to help her govern the kingdom and to produce children who would continue the Catholic restoration she planned. At 37, Mary was past the typical childbearing age for the Tudor era, but not impossibly old. Women did sometimes conceive and give birth successfully in their late 30s and even early 40s. It was risky, but not impossible. Mary's cousin, Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, suggested that she marry his son, Prince Philip of Spain. It was a politically advantageous match that would ally England with the most powerful Catholic monarchy in Europe. It was also wildly unpopular with the English people, who feared Spanish influence and resented the idea of a foreign prince consorting their queen. But Mary, desperate for support and genuinely attracted to Philip despite never having met him, agreed to the marriage. Philip was 27 years old, 11 years younger than Mary. He arrived in England in July 1554, met Mary for the first time, and married her just 2 days later on July 25th at Winchester Cathedral. Almost immediately, Mary believed herself pregnant. By September 1554, just weeks after the wedding, Mary began showing symptoms of pregnancy. Her menstrual period stopped. She experienced morning sickness. Her breasts swelled and became tender. Her abdomen began to expand. Royal physicians examined and confirmed what seemed obvious. The queen was with child. The news was received with a mixture of joy and relief by Mary's supporters, and with dismay by Protestant reformers who realized that a Catholic heir would cement the return to Rome. Ambassadors sent excited reports to foreign courts. Charles V was thrilled at the prospect of a grandchild who would be heir to both England and eventually Spain. Mary herself was overjoyed. After so many years of suffering and uncertainty, after watching her mother's endless pregnancy losses, after her own traumatic childhood, Mary was finally going to have a child, finally going to fulfill her duty as queen, finally going to secure the Catholic succession. She even reported feeling the baby move in her womb, the quickening that confirmed to Tudor minds that a living child was developing inside her. By November 1554, Mary's pregnancy seemed well advanced. Foreign ambassadors reported her stomach clearly shows it and her dresses no longer fit her. Everyone was convinced that the queen would deliver in the spring of 1555, probably in April or May. Laws were passed anticipating the birth, providing for Philip's role during any potential regency if Mary died in childbed. The royal nursery was prepared. Wet nurses were engaged. Announcement letters were written and signed, leaving blank only the date of birth and the sex of the child. In April 1555, Mary went into confinement at Hampton Court Palace, withdrawing from public life to await the birth according to royal custom. The practice required expectant mothers to seclude themselves in darkened, overheated chambers for 6 weeks before the expected delivery date, attended only by female servants and midwives. No men were allowed except the royal physicians in case of emergency, and then only after much deliberation. Mary waited, and waited, and waited. April passed with no labor. May arrived with no contractions. June came and went with no baby. By this point, 11 months into what everyone had believed was a pregnancy, people began to whisper. Something was terribly wrong. Mary herself remained convinced she was pregnant. She insisted the original due date calculation had been incorrect. Surely the baby would come soon. Surely any day now. Her female attendants, trapped in the confinement chambers with an increasingly unstable queen, reported alarming behavior. Mary would spend hours curled up on the floor in the fetal position, sobbing inconsolably, or she would rock back and forth with her knees pulled up to her chest, a near impossible position for a heavily pregnant woman, mumbling to herself and praying desperately. She oscillated between frantic hope and crushing despair. She prayed constantly, convinced that her failure to produce a child quickly enough meant God was displeased with her. She fasted. She did penance. She promised to burn even more heretics if God would only grant her a living child. The persecution of Protestants intensified, with nearly 300 people burned at the stake during Mary's 5-year reign, earning her the lasting nickname Bloody Mary. Mary believed that God would reward her campaign to restore Catholicism with the gift of a son. But no son came. By August 1555, even Mary could no longer deny reality. There was no baby. There had never been a baby. The swelling in her abdomen gradually decreased. Her breasts stopped producing milk. The physicians finally admitted what everyone else had known for months. The Queen's pregnancy had been a phantom, a cruel illusion produced by her desperate desire for a child and by whatever medical condition was causing the physical symptoms. Mary emerged from confinement at Hampton Court utterly humiliated, rail-thin, sickly, and broken. She never publicly acknowledged what had happened. The pregnancy was simply never mentioned again at court, at least not in front of the Queen. But rumors spread like wildfire through the kingdom and across Europe. Alehouses and market stalls buzzed with whispered speculation. Some said Mary had given birth to a monster, a dog or a monkey, and that the creature had been secretly destroyed. Others claimed the baby was stillborn and had been quietly buried. Still others suggested that desperate courtiers had sought to find a substitute infant to pass off as the royal heir, though no such conspiracy ever materialized. The truth was both simpler and more tragic than any of the rumors. Mary had experienced what modern medicine calls pseudocyesis, or phantom pregnancy. It's a rare psychological condition in which the body mimics all the signs and symptoms of pregnancy, sometimes for months, despite the complete absence of a fetus. Women with pseudocyesis experience missed periods, morning sickness, abdominal swelling, breast enlargement, weight gain, and even the sensation of fetal movement. Their bodies are responding to psychological signals, with the brain apparently altering hormone production to create these physical manifestations. The condition occurs most commonly in women who desperately want to be pregnant, who are under intense pressure to produce children, or who have a history of infertility or pregnancy loss. Mary fit all these criteria perfectly. At 38 years old, newly married for the first time, ruling a kingdom torn by religious strife, desperate to produce a Catholic heir, haunted by her mother's reproductive failures, Mary was psychologically overwhelmed by a need for a pregnancy. Her body responded by producing pregnancy-like symptoms, even though no conception had occurred. Modern medicine recognizes pseudocyesis as a genuine medical condition, not a delusion or a conscious deception. The physical symptoms are real, even if no pregnancy exists. The condition is notoriously difficult to treat because the affected woman genuinely believes she is pregnant and will not accept any evidence to the contrary, no matter how definitive. And indeed, Mary refused to accept what had happened. When her husband Philip left England in September 1555, departing for the Netherlands on military and political business, Mary was devastated. She pleaded with him to stay, weeping and begging, but Philip had seen enough. The marriage had failed to produce an heir, his wife was significantly older than him, and his presence in England had become politically toxic. He left and would not return for nearly 2 years.
Mary sank into depression. Her health, never robust, deteriorated further. She suffered from severe headaches, irregular periods that were sometimes absent for months and then arrived with debilitating pain, and chronic abdominal problems. Modern physicians analyzing her symptoms have proposed several possible diagnoses. One theory is that Mary suffered from a pituitary tumor, specifically a prolactinoma. This type of tumor would explain many of her symptoms. Prolactinomas cause excessive production of the hormone prolactin, which can suppress menstruation, cause lactation even in non-pregnant women, create abdominal bloating, and contribute to depression and mood disturbances. An untreated pituitary tumor can also press on nearby structures in the brain, causing headaches, vision problems, and hormonal imbalances. A 1600 painting of Mary from 1554 shows some suggestive signs: a puffy face, receding hairline, flushed cheeks, and pale skin that could indicate hypothyroidism secondary to pituitary dysfunction. Another theory is that Mary suffered from ovarian cysts or uterine tumors that caused abdominal distension, pain, and hormonal irregularities. Ovarian cysts can grow large enough to cause a visibly swollen abdomen that mimics pregnancy. They can also cause irregular periods, pain, and the sensation of pressure or movement in the abdomen that could be mistaken for fetal movement. Endometriosis, uterine fibroids, or even ovarian cancer could all explain Mary's symptoms. We'll never know for certain what medical condition caused Mary's phantom pregnancies, because the diagnostic tools of the Tudor era were utterly inadequate to identify such conditions. But whatever the physical cause, the psychological impact was devastating. In early 1557, incredibly, Mary believed herself pregnant again. This second phantom pregnancy was met with widespread skepticism both at court and among the public. Philip had returned briefly to England in March 1557, making conception theoretically possible, but very few people actually believed Mary was pregnant. She was now 40 years old, visibly ill, and had already endured the humiliation of one failed pregnancy. But Mary insisted. Once again she reported the symptoms: missed periods, abdominal swelling, nausea. Once again her physicians, reluctant to contradict their queen, confirmed the pregnancy. Once again preparations were made for a royal birth that would never come. This time the phantom pregnancy was briefer and less dramatic. By the summer of 1557, it was clear that once again there would be no child. Mary never publicly acknowledged the second failure either. She simply carried on as if nothing had happened, focusing obsessively on her religious policies and the persecution of Protestant heretics. But privately, she must have been destroyed. 2 phantom pregnancies, 2 national humiliations, 0 children. The Tudor succession, which she had fought so hard to secure through her marriage to Philip, remained unresolved. And worse, the law and her father's will made it clear who would inherit the throne if Mary died childless: her younger half-sister Elizabeth, the daughter of Anne Boleyn, the Protestant princess who represented everything Mary had spent her reign trying to undo. Mary's health continued to deteriorate through 1558. She suffered from fever, fluid retention, and progressive weakness. Some historians believe she may have died from ovarian or uterine cancer. Others suggest influenza complicated by the tumors or cysts that had caused her phantom pregnancies. Whatever killed her, Mary I died on November 17, 1558, at St. James's Palace in London. She was 42 years old. She had reigned for just 5 years. She died childless, having failed in her primary goal of producing a Catholic heir. With Mary's death, the crown passed to Elizabeth, the last surviving child of Henry VIII and the final hope for the continuation of the Tudor line. Elizabeth I became Queen of England on November 17, 1558, at age 25. Unlike her half-sister Mary, Elizabeth would reign for 44 years, become one of England's greatest monarchs, preside over a golden age of English culture and naval power, and be celebrated as Gloriana, the Virgin Queen, Good Queen Bess. But Elizabeth would also make a choice that ensured the complete and final extinction of the Tudor bloodline. She would never marry and never have children. Elizabeth's decision not to marry was complicated, deeply personal, and hotly debated both during her lifetime and by historians ever since. Was it political calculation, a way to maintain her power and independence? Was it psychological trauma stemming from her mother's execution, her father's treatment of his wives, and her own dangerous experiences as a young woman? Was it medical, some condition that made her believe she couldn't safely bear children? Or was it simply Elizabeth's preference, a genuine choice to remain unmarried? We may never know the full truth. What we know is that Elizabeth was courted by numerous suitors over the course of her reign, including King Philip II of Spain, her widowed brother-in-law, who proposed to her almost immediately after Mary's death. She rejected him. She was courted by various European princes and nobles. She rejected them all. She had a long, intense, possibly romantic relationship with Robert Dudley, Earl of Leicester, her childhood friend and constant companion. Court gossips whispered for years that they were secret lovers, that Elizabeth had borne Dudley's children in secret, that they were secretly married. None of it was true. Elizabeth never married him or anyone else. She cultivated her image as the Virgin Queen, married to England itself, styling herself as a Protestant Virgin Mary figure who served her kingdom rather than a husband. It was brilliant political theater, but it was also a biological dead end. Without marriage, without children, the Tudor line would die with Elizabeth. And she knew it. Parliament begged her repeatedly to marry and produce an heir. Her councillors lectured her about her duty to the kingdom. Foreign ambassadors pressed their princes' suits. The English people worried constantly about what would happen when their childless queen died. Who would inherit? Would there be civil war? Would England be invaded by Catholic powers seeking to install their own candidate? Elizabeth deflected, delayed, and refused to commit. She claimed she would marry eventually, but the time was never right. She dangled the possibility of marriage to string along foreign suitors for political advantage, then backed out when it suited her. As she aged and it became clear she would never marry, she finally stated that she would name no successor until her deathbed, forcing England to wait in anxious uncertainty. When Elizabeth I died on March 24, 1603 at Richmond Palace in London, she was 69 years old. She had reigned for 44 years, longer than any of her Tudor predecessors. She died childless, as she had always intended. With Mary's death, the crown passed to James VI of Scotland, son of Mary Queen of Scots, who became James I of England, founding the Stuart dynasty. The Tudors, who had seized power in 1485 and ruled England for 118 years through 5 monarchs, were extinct. Let's step back and look at the complete picture of this multi-generational catastrophe. Henry VII and Elizabeth of York had 7 or 8 children, but only 4 survived infancy, a survival rate of only 50 to 57%. One of those survivors, Arthur, died at age 15 before producing any heirs. Another, Edmund, died at age 1. A third, Catherine, died within days. Only Henry VIII, Margaret, and Mary survived to adulthood. Henry VIII had 6 wives and at least 11 confirmed pregnancies. 70% of those pregnancies ended in miscarriage or stillbirth. Only 4 children survived infancy: Mary, Elizabeth, Edward, and the illegitimate Henry Fitzroy. That's a catastrophic failure rate that was 7 times worse than the outcomes for Henry's courtiers. In the next generation, the Tudor curse continued. Edward VI, the longed-for male heir, died at age 15 from tuberculosis without ever marrying or producing children. Mary I suffered 2 phantom pregnancies and died childless at age 42. Henry Fitzroy, Duke of Richmond, died in his late teens, possibly from tuberculosis. And Elizabeth I chose never to marry or have children, dying childless at age 69. 4 generations of Tudors, spanning 118 years, and it all ended in complete biological failure.
The male line died out with Edward VI in 1553. The entire bloodline died out with Elizabeth I in 1603. Not a single living legitimate descendant of Henry VII remained. What caused this catastrophe? Was it genetic? Some inherited condition that made the Tudors vulnerable to reproductive failure and early death?
Was it environmental, the result of lifestyle factors like Henry VIII's obesity, poor diet, and jousting injuries? Was it infectious disease, with tuberculosis or other epidemics cutting down Tudor heirs before they could reproduce? Was it pure bad luck, a statistical anomaly that just happened to cluster in one unlucky family? Or was it some combination of all these factors, a perfect storm of biology, environment, and chance that conspired to destroy one of history's most famous royal dynasties? Modern medical analysis suggests it was probably multifactorial. The Kell blood group incompatibility theory could explain Henry VIII's pattern of pregnancy losses with his first two wives. Male factor infertility related to sperm DNA damage could explain the overall high rate of miscarriages and stillbirths. Possible genetic lung conditions could explain the eerily similar deaths of Arthur Tudor, Edward VI, and Henry Fitzroy in their teens. Pituitary tumors or reproductive tract pathology could explain Mary I's phantom pregnancies, and psychological trauma, combined with possible medical issues, could explain Elizabeth's decision to never marry. But regardless of the specific causes, the outcome was undeniable. The Tudor dynasty, for all its power and glory, for all Henry VIII's desperate efforts to secure the succession, for all the break with Rome and the execution of wives and the religious upheaval, could not overcome the fundamental biological crisis that plagued the family across 4 generations. They became one of history's most famous royal houses, but they also became a cautionary tale about the fragility of dynasties, the dangers of obsessing over male heirs, and the simple biological reality that sometimes, despite all the power and wealth in the world, reproduction fails. The irony is thick and tragic. Henry VIII broke with the Catholic Church, created the Church of England, dissolved hundreds of monasteries, executed thousands of people, and tore his kingdom apart, all in pursuit of a male heir. He got his male heir, Edward VI, but Edward died at 15 without children. Meanwhile, the daughters Henry had spent decades trying to disinherit, the daughters he declared illegitimate, the daughters he insisted couldn't rule England, ended up reigning for a combined 49 years. Mary ruled for 5 years, Elizabeth ruled for 44. Between them, they governed England for half a century, far longer than Edward's 6-year reign or even Henry VIII's 38 years on the throne. But neither of them produced heirs. The obsession with male succession, the belief that only a son could secure a dynasty, the refusal to accept that daughters could successfully rule, all of it was based on assumptions that turned out to be wrong. Mary and Elizabeth proved women could rule, but the damage was already done. The Tudor bloodline was already doomed. If Henry VIII had simply accepted Catherine of Aragon's daughter Mary as his heir and put less pressure on his wives to produce sons at any cost, if he had focused on securing Mary's succession instead of pursuing divorce after divorce in search of a male child, if he had been willing to let women inherit his throne without treating them as disappointing failures, the Tudor line might have survived. But he couldn't. The Tudor obsession with male heirs, combined with whatever biological factors were causing the catastrophic pregnancy failures, sealed the dynasty's fate. By the time Elizabeth took the throne in 1558, she was the last Tudor standing, and she chose not to continue the bloodline. Perhaps, having witnessed her father's treatment of her mother, Anne Boleyn, having seen Jane Seymour die in childbirth, having watched her half-sister Mary suffer through 2 phantom pregnancies, having been declared illegitimate and nearly executed herself, Elizabeth decided the Tudor bloodline wasn't worth continuing. Perhaps she looked at her family's history of reproductive catastrophe and concluded that marriage and motherhood were too dangerous, too painful, too likely to end in tragedy. Perhaps she simply didn't want to risk becoming another casualty of the Tudor curse. Whatever her reasons, the result was clear. On March 24, 1603, when Elizabeth I died at Richmond Palace, the House of Tudor died with her. No direct descendants, no legitimate heirs, no one left to carry on the bloodline that Henry VII had fought so hard to establish and that Henry VIII had sacrificed so much to preserve. The dynasty that had ruled England through some of its most dramatic and transformative years simply ceased to exist. Today, millions of words have been written about the Tudors. We remember Henry VIII's 6 wives, the break with Rome, the dissolution of the monasteries, the religious conflicts, Elizabeth I's Golden Age, Shakespeare, the defeat of the Spanish Armada, and all the dramatic political intrigue of the era. But we sometimes forget the simple, brutal biological reality underlying all of it. This was a family that couldn't reproduce successfully. This was a dynasty plagued by miscarriage, stillbirth, infant mortality, mysterious illnesses, phantom pregnancies, and ultimately extinction. For all their power, for all their historical importance, for all the ways they shaped England and the world, the Tudors couldn't overcome the most basic challenge facing any family, passing their genes to the next generation. They tried desperately. They failed completely. And in 1603, after 118 years of Tudor rule, the bloodline went extinct, a victim of forces that even a king's power couldn't control. The irony of the Tudor family's infertility crisis is a reminder that sometimes, despite wealth, despite power, despite desperate effort, biology has the final word. And in the case of the Tudors, that final word was extinction.